Hi everyone, my name is Will Valida. I'm a software engineer and cloud architect, and in this video we're going to learn how we can integrate Azure Front Door WAF with Azure Container Apps. Now, in a previous video, I talked a little bit about how we can enable HTTP ingress into our Azure Container Apps so we can actually expose them onto the public internet. And one of the questions I got coming out of that video was, would we actually do this for our production scenarios? The answer really here is no. The idea is you probably want to keep them internal and then use something like Azure Front Door or Azure Application Gateway to expose your container apps so you can have a WAF policy or a firewall policy to protect what's coming into your application so you can prevent something like bots or DOS attacks trying to disrupt your web application. So what we're going to do in this video, I'm going to show you how you can set up Azure Front Door WAF with a container app environment. So if we have a look here at this diagram that I've got in Draw.io, let me see if I can scroll around. Cool, that's fantastic. Essentially what we can do is we can actually provision Azure Private Link Service in front of an internal ACA load balancer. A private endpoint with the NIC with a private IP and a virtual network will be connected to this private link service, and this will also use an Azure Front Door premium SKU instance that can then be used to connect to the private endpoint, which is otherwise known as a private origin in Azure Front Door. And this helps us to apply those WAF policies and help expose the container app to the public internet, but rather than hitting it directly, we're going through Azure Front Door here. Now, from a container apps perspective, we have our container app that's deployed to a container app environment. We also have a subnet within a virtual network, so we'll provision that. And also this private load balancer here, which will connect the private link service to. So the kind of 5 steps that we need to think about when deploying this. We need to deploy an internal Azure Container App environment with a virtual network. We need to create the Azure Front Door Premium instance, the origin group, and the route. We also need to create the Azure Private Link service. We also will be able to deploy our container app into that internal environment, and then we'll be able to approve the private endpoint connection to our private link service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first off jump into Azure, and if I just put it on the right screen. So here's something that I have deployed earlier. So I've got my internal container app environment. I've got that integrated within this virtual network, and I also have this infrastructure subnet. So if I go into this container app, if you watch my last video on Azure Container Apps integration with Application Gateway, you can see that when I go to this application here and I try and go into that endpoint, I'm not going to be able to reach it because it's a container app that's deployed into an internal environment. So let's start off by heading into our Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do first is we're going to set up our private link service. So just get all my screens in order. Fantastic. Cool. So I've got, just having a review of the Bicep code that I've done so far. I've got modules for my virtual network, my log analytics workspace, my container app environment with the subnet that I'm integrating there. The container app environment into there, and then also the container app. The container app is just a very simple hello world container app. There's nothing special here. If I go into my container app environment Bicep file, here I'm just saying that this is going to be an internal environment and I'm deploying it to a subnet within my virtual network. And then for the outputs, I'm outputting the domain and also static IP of my container app environment. And then for my container app, I'm outputting the fully qualified domain name for my container app. So these are things I'm going to be needing a little bit later. But the first thing I really want to do is work on that private link service. So under network, I've got all of these folders here, and I'm going to store all of this code on GitHub. I'm going to create a new module called private link service. And for the interest of time, I will just copy and paste parameters and variables, and I'll just explain them as we go along. So we're going to be giving our our private link service a name. We're going to deploy it to a location. We're also going to give it its own particular subnet as well. And we're also going to provide the default domain name address, for our container app environment. Because as you can see here, I'm using the load balancer, this Kubernetes internal. So actually, if I jump back into the portal and I just look at load balancers, I should see that I've got my load balancer for my container app environment deployed. It's called Kubernetes internal. And this, I'm going to need this later on so I can actually hook that up to my private link service. So I will go back into my Bicep file. And the way that I'm going to do this, this is deployed to a resource group name. So what we need to do, this is an existing resource. So I'm going to create a load balancer resource, but it's going to be an existing one. So that's going to be under network/load balancer. That's going to be an existing resource. For the name, I'm going to pass in that variable for my load balancer name. And then for the scope, it's going to be in using the resource group method here. I'm going to pass in this app environment resource group name, because if I actually go back into the portal, if I click into that resource group name, it's been assigned this random kind of resource group name. We don't have control of this. Well, we've had it deployed for us, I should say, when I deployed my container app environment. And this Mango Forest numbers with a little bit of letters there. If I actually go back into my application, my container app environment, if I see the JSON view of this, I should be able to see, there we go. So that's the default name for the environment that I've just deployed. Cool, so that's kind of how I'm going to reference the load balancer service. So now if I come down, I'm going to create my private link service. So private link service. This is again in the Microsoft.network namespace. And it's going to be private link services. I'm going to give it the name, deploy it to the location, not the load balancer. Getting a little bit excited there. So for the properties, I'm going to set the auto approval for this at the subscription level. So that's going to be subscription ID. And then for visibility, this is going to be visible at the subscription level as well. So subscriptions. Oh, that's a problem with having fat fingers. You never know how you're going to do when you're coding live, but that's all right. I'm not going to put anything for the fully qualified domain names. I'm going to disable proxy protocol. And then for my load balancer front-end IP configuration, I'm going to be using that load balancer that we've just passed through. So that's going to be load balancer dot properties dot front-end configurations ID. So it's going to be the ID of that. What else do I need? I need IP configurations as well. So I'm going to give this a name. I'm just going to give it a very simple name. So IP config.0. And for the properties, I'm going to use a dynamic allocation method. For the subnet, I'm going to pass in the subnet ID. And one thing I need to do is actually go back into my virtual network Bicep file and actually create a subnet for that. And there's a couple of outputs I'm going to need. So I'm going to need the ID of the private link service. And I'm also going to need the name as well. Name. Fantastic. There we go. So now what I want to do, I want to go into my virtual network Bicep file, and I'm going to create a new subnet for my private link service. So just go there, and then in my subnet, the name will be the private link subnet name. For my properties, I'm going to give it an address prefix of, not that, 10.02.0.24. I'm not going to give it any delegations. And for the private endpoint network policies, I'm going to disable that. And private link service network policies, disable that as well. One thing I need to do, I need to also reference that as an existing resource as well. So when I do subsequent deployments, I'm not going to lose that every time I deploy this. That's just something, I'll add some documentation to that in below, but that's just when you're using Bicep and deployments, it's good to actually refer to your subnets as existing resources so you don't kind of lose any IP allocation, anything like that. When you're doing subsequent deployments, I'm also going to output the ID of the private link service subnet. Cool, so that should be everything I need for my private link service. So if I go into my main.bicep file, I will add another parameter for the name of the private link service, and then I'll go ahead and start to use that module. So PLS, networking, private link service. I'll give the deployment name, which will just be PLS. The default domain will be the default domain of the container app environment. Location will be the location where I'm deploying all my resources, which is the location of my resource group. The name will be the private service link name, and then the subnet ID is another output from this virtual network module that I've got. Cool, so now if I open up my Bicep visualizer, I'll put it up here. Just scroll in so we can see a little bit. There we go. So in my virtual network, I've got a new subnet for my private link service, and I've also got a private link service that I'm creating as part of this module here. Fantastic. So I'm just going to get my terminal back and run that. And once that starts running, we'll just let it go, and we're through the power of video editing because that's going to take some time. We'll see what gets deployed and see the result of that. Cool, so it looks like that's been deployed. So if I go into my resource group, I can see everything's deployed there. Go into the overview, I can see my private link service has been created, and also a NIC as well, which is pretty good. I'll just check that the subnets are there as well. Yep, there's my subnet for my private link service as well with the IP address. Fantastic, cool. So now if I head back into Visual Studio Code, we're going to start coding out our Azure Front Door Premium instance. So there are going to be a few resources that we're going to create here. We're going to, again, create Azure Front Door Premium. We're going to create an endpoint, origin group, an origin, and a route. So your endpoint will define a publicly accessible global endpoint on Azure Front Door. Your origin group will define the load balancing and health probe settings. The origin will associate our container app ingress hostname and header with the private link service that we've just deployed. And then the route is going to bind that endpoint to the origin group. So what I'm going to do, I am going to create a new Azure Front Door Bicep file. Azure Front Door.bicep. There we go. And I'll actually get rid of the terminal for now. And I'm going to add some parameters. And we are just going to, I'll leave out the policy name and security policy name for now. We'll just focus on creating our origin group, the route, the endpoint, the front door instance itself, and also our origin group. So let's start with the front door resource. So I'm going to call this front door, and that's going to sit in Microsoft.cdn/profiles. So I'm going to give it the name. It's a global resource, so I'm going to set the global location as global, and then I'm going to use a premium Azure Front Door SKU, and I'll also set some origin response timeout in seconds. I'll set that to 30 seconds. Cool, so now what I want to do is add my origin group. So again, resource, origin group. Get that mouse out of the way. See what I'm actually doing. So Microsoft.cdn/profiles, and the ones that I'm looking for is origin groups. So the name will be the origin group name. The parent obviously will be front door. So we're associating this origin group with our front door instance. And then I'll add some properties. So for my load balancing settings, I'll just do 4 for the sample size, 3 for the successful sample sizes, samples required, and then additional latency in milliseconds, I'll just set that to 50. And then I'm going to set the health probe settings as well. So the probe path is just going to sit on /. The request type is going to be a GET. The protocol that I'm going to use for this is HTTPS, and the interval seconds, I'm going to poll that every 60 seconds. So we're going to, on our container app domain, we're going to run a health check just to make sure that when we navigate to our front door instance, that endpoint is going to be healthy. And I'm going to just disable session affinity for now. Awesome. So there's my origin group created. So now what I want to do is define my endpoint. So create a new resource, call this AFD endpoint. That's going to sit in Microsoft.cdn/profiles. If I had an N, then that would be helpful. Profiles and AFD endpoints. There we go. I'm going to give that the name, and again, this is going to be another global resource. So I'll just write global. Let me scroll down a little bit and get some more real estate going. The parent of that will be my front door, and then some for my properties. So auto-generated domain label scope. I'm going to use that for reuse tenant, so I can actually deploy this again if I wanted to. And then I'm going to go ahead and enable that. Awesome. Now we can define our route. So AFD route, and this resource sits inside AFD endpoints.routes, or /routes, I should say. I'm going to just call this route. The parent of that is going to be my endpoint. So that endpoint is going to route to this route. And then we're going to assign some properties. So for custom domains, we're not working with custom domains in this. If people want to see that, please let me know, and I'll spend some time to actually cover custom domains separately. I've got to assign it to my origin group. So the ID of that will be the ID of the origin group resource. And then for the origin path, I'll just set it to the same, just to the /. For my rule sets, I won't add any rule sets here. Supported protocols, we're going to go HTTP and HTTPS. And then the patterns to match, just anything there. Forwarding protocol, we are going to match request. Link to default domain, that's going to be enabled. HTTPS redirect will enable that, and then just enable this route. Cool. And then finally, what we want to do is create our AFD origin. So I'm going to create resource AFD origin, and then Microsoft CDN/profiles, and that should be in origin group origins. Cool. So that's going to be just going to give it an origin name, and then the parent of that will be the origin group. And then for the properties, for our host name, I'm passing in the fully qualified domain name from my container app. So when we actually use this module, we will use the fully qualified domain name for my container app that I want to connect to through front door. I'll set the HTTP port to 80, the HTTPS port to 443. The origin host header, again, will be the fully qualified domain name for my container app. Priority, this will be 1, the weights 1000. I will enable this by actually putting enabled, not disabled. For the shared private link resource, I'm going to use the ID of the private link, which I'll pass through to this module as well. And then I'll also provide the location to that private link. I'll put an approved status in there, and then a request message, because I'll have to go ahead and approve this private endpoint. So approve this request to allow front door to access the container app. That's what we're trying to do. The container app. Cool. And let me just see if there's anything else I need to check here. I also need to enforce certificate name check as well. There we go. Cool. So before I go ahead and define a WAF policy and also any security rules or security policies, I'm just going to go ahead and deploy that Bicep file. In fact, before I do that, it would be a great idea to actually use that module. So let me just get rid of that here. Module front door under networks AFD. And what I will need to do is just copy and paste some parameters that I've made earlier for this. So there we go. Come back down. The AFD endpoint name, the fully qualified domain name would be the app container app. Outputs, the fully qualified domain name, location, the front door name, origin group name, origin name, and then the private link ID. Outputs. Oh, no, it's not the subnet I want. It's the private link that I want. So pls.output ID. There we go. So that'll be the ID of my private link service, which makes sense. Cool. So now that I've got that, I'm just going to go ahead and run this deployment. I'll let it run and we'll see what happens when we come back. So everything in AFD has been deployed. So if I actually go into the portal, I can go into my Azure Front Door. You can see my endpoint has been created. My origin group has been created. Let's have a look at origins. There's my origin group. No associated routes there, but we might remedy that when we start to add our policy. So, WAF policy. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm back in Visual Studio Code. Scroll down to the bottom. And now what I want to do is provide a parameter for my WAF policy, and I can go ahead and actually start creating that resource. So go down to the bottom and we're going to create a new resource, WAF policy, and it's going to be Microsoft Network / Front Door Web Application Firewall policies. Going to give that a name. The location of that's going to be a global resource, and the SKU is going to match Premium Front Door. The properties, so the policy setting for that, I am going to enable the policy. I'm going to put it in prevention mode, and I'm going to request a body check and enable that. I am still in properties, going to go into manage rules. Let me scroll down a little bit. So the manage rule set that I'm going to use. So the rule set type will be the Microsoft default rule set. The rule set version, I'm going to set to 1.1. Nothing for the group overrides and nothing for exclusions, but I have to include them anyway. And then for the second managed rule set, it's going to be Microsoft Bot Manager rule set. Make sure I spell that right. And yep, that's all good. And then the rule set version 1.0. And again, rule group overrides and exclusions set to empty. Cool. So now what I can do is I can add another parameter for the ADF security policy name, which I'll do at the top here. And scroll back down, and we can start to build out our AFD security policy. And that will sit in the Microsoft. My typing is terrible this evening, I apologize. CDN /profiles /security policies. There we go. Going to give it the WAF security policy, AFD security policy name. The parent of that will be my front door instance. And then for my properties, the parameters, it's going to be a Web Application Firewall. And I'm going to assign it to the WAF policy that we've just created. Using the WAF Policy's ID. And then for associations, I'm going to add the domains. The ID will be the endpoint ID for our endpoint resource. And then the patterns to match would be star. Cool, there we go. So that should be everything we need for our policy, our WAF policy, and also our security policy. So let me just check that everything is okay. It looks like it's okay. Make sure that origin path is correct. Cool, awesome. So if I go into my main.bicep file now, I will add a parameter for my WAF policy name, and I'll also add a parameter for the security policy name. I'll just type this out. And then copy and paste the value. So then I can actually use this in my front door module. So I need to add one for my AFD security policy name, and then also for the WAF policy name. There we go, cool. So now if I open up Bicep Visualizer, put this there, scroll in, I can see that in my front door resource, I've got my WAF policy, I've got my security policy, the Azure Front Door endpoint, origin group, the origins and the route associated with the endpoint and the origin group, all pointing to the front door, which is hooked up to my private link service, which should be connected to my subnet. Cool, so go back into main.bicep, open up my terminal again, and I'm going to run that deployment. And we'll let that run, see what happens, and when it's finished, we'll come back to it. Cool, that looks like it has been successful. So what I should be able to do, if I go into my resource group, if I go into Azure Front Door, I should be able to go to this endpoint, copy and paste, hit that, and service unavailable. And that's very deliberate. So there's one final thing that we need to do for our integration with Azure Front Door to work. So I'm going to go back into the portal, and I'm going to look for private endpoints. I'm just going to go into private link services here, and here's the private link center, or for our private link service that we created earlier. And if I look at my private endpoint connections, I see that it's still pending. So we still need to approve this request to allow Front Door to actually access our container app. So I'm just going to click on this button here and approve that. And there's the message that I've done, written earlier in my Bicep code. So I'll just click yes for that. You can do that through the Azure CLI, but I wanted to make this point a little bit more visual so you can actually understand what's going on. I believe you can do it in Bicep as well, so maybe I'll update the Bicep code to actually automatically approve the private endpoint connection. But for now, I'm just going to let that run. Cool, so that's successfully approved. So hopefully, when I navigate to this now, there's my Azure Container App. So to prove my point, if I go back into my resource group, if I try to hit the endpoint for this container app directly, that's going to be denied because I've deployed my container app to an internal environment. So communication is going to be limited to between my container apps and outside it's going to be limited to just my environment. Whereas with Azure Front Door, now that we've used a private link service to connect Azure Front Door to our container app, when we hit this endpoint that we've defined in Azure Front Door, we can do that it's going to be direct to our container app via Azure Front Door. Cool, so that wraps up this video on integrating Azure Front Door WAF with Azure Container Apps. If you like this video, give it a like. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comment section below. Anything you weren't unsure of, just let me know and I'll be happy to answer any questions. If you want to have a look at the code that I wrote during this video, I'm going to be uploading them to my personal GitHub. There will be a link in the description below, as well as a bit of supplementary documentation for how everything else works around Azure Front Door and also Azure Container Apps, and particularly networking with Azure Container Apps. No matter where you are in the world, I hope you're having a great day, and we'll see you all next time.